My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas.
You were actually dismissed from, where was it? Is it Bristol University in 2021?
Yeah.
What happened?
Do you want the long or the short version? So essentially I'd started there in late 2017. In February 2018, I did a lecture on Islamophobia, which I'd done many times before, in which I spent approximately 2.5 minutes discussing the role of Zionists and Zionism in encouraging Islamophobia. We know it's 2.5 minutes because the tape of it was subsequently leaked to the Jewish News, and it's still online. You can go and listen to the terrible things that I said in those 2.5 minutes. And essentially, I was making the arguments that I've made before everywhere else, which is that that there's a specifically Zionist form of Islamophobia, that the Zionists encourage Islamophobia as a matter of national policy, foreign policy objective. And so 2 anonymous students complained. There was a process whereby the university rejected their complaint. Then someone else was drafted in to complain by a Zionist lobby group, who was the head of the Jewish Society in the university, which is in the UK is part of the Union of Jewish Students, which is a formally Zionist organisation. That complaint was rejected. The university then said, "Oh, you might want to appeal, but you might want to wait until we introduce the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism." And she said, "Oh yes, I would like to wait." And then they introduced the IHRA, and she appealed, and they then took the appeal under the new rules, of course, which is completely unjust. But in any case, they found, after a long 9-month investigation by an external QC, now a KC, that I'd done nothing at all wrong, that nothing I'd ever said, because they looked back to materials that I'd said some 10 years before I'd even been at the University of Bristol. Nothing I'd ever said, not a paragraph, not a sentence, not a comma, was anti-Semitic. So they said, "Well, nothing to say. You're in the clear." And I said, "Well, can you tell people that I'm in the clear, that you've determined that I'm not an anti-Semite?" Because the press are still reporting that I am. And they said, "Oh, well, I'm not sure about that." So after 6 weeks, I went on a public meeting and I said, as some of you will know, and these words are burned into my brain, as some of you will know, I've been attacked and complained about by the head of the Bristol Jewish Society and the president of the Union of Jewish Students, Zionist organisations, as a result, et cetera, et cetera. And that, of course, led to all sorts of other harassment of the university by Zionist organisations, internally by Zionist staff, and of course more than 100 members of the House of Commons and House of Lords who wrote to the university demanding that I be dealt with properly. And so they investigated me again and concluded that I hadn't done anything wrong, but nevertheless that I had brought students into conflict, and therefore that was enough to sack me for unprofessional conduct. I took them to a tribunal. I won. The tribunal said that wasn't the reason they sacked me. The reason they sacked me was that I had anti-Zionist views, which they thought were not appropriate, and therefore that I was wrongfully dismissed. And in addition to that, the court concluded that anti-Zionist views of the type I espoused and wrote about in the case were and should be protected as philosophical beliefs, as worthy of respect in a democratic society, to use the terminology in the Equality Act. And that established the principle that anti-Zionist views are worthy of respect in a democratic society, should be protected, and you can't be sacked if you're an anti-Zionist. And of course, since then, many people have been sacked for being anti-Zionist. The university took the tribunal to appeal. We heard the appeal last November, and we're still waiting for the judgment, which should have come out some 3 months ago. But the judge is the new president of the Employment Appeal Tribunal. He's very busy, no doubt, but he said that part of the reason it's taken so long is because there were so many grounds of appeal lodged by the University of Bristol with their comically incompetent legal team. So we're waiting to see if the court will uphold the finding of the lower court, and that will, of course, be a second decision of a UK court and will make it a binding precedent in law. So we're hoping, of course, that will be the case. I fully expect that will be the case, but we have to see.
David, you should know better. I mean, how dare you criticize the chosen people?
Well, I mean, the thing is that, as I've said many times, I didn't start off by thinking I'm going to study Zionism. I started off really after the illegal invasion of Iraq and looking at propaganda post 9/11 and started to look at Islamophobia. Why was there this big upsurge in anti-Muslim commentary in the media and elsewhere? And of course, that took us to examining not just the media's coverage, which we've done on a number of occasions, but also looking at the way in which elite ideas and policy ideas about Islam were mobilized in particular by policy-related think tanks like the Henry Jackson Society or the Policy Exchange. And it was only when we looked at who was funding these organizations that we came across a whole list of funders, which were all charities which were named after individuals. They were family charities, essentially, and we didn't understand what they were. And so we looked at what else they funded. As well as funding Islamophobia, what else were they funding? And it turned out, which I wasn't anticipating, it turned out they were funding the IDF and illegal settlements in the West Bank. And we're like, oh, it's the Zionists. These people are Zionists. And so that, of course, led us to think about Zionist family foundations and how they fund the genocide. They fund Zionist groups in the UK and many other places as well. And that started us off into studying Zionism directly. And of course, it wasn't very long after that started that we started to be accused of being anti-Semitic. And I remember the first time, I think it was the first time I was accused of being anti-Semitic was when I let it be known that I had invited to my home in Glasgow an author who was touring his new book around Scotland, and he came and stayed with me for a few days while he toured around Scotland. And this author was a terrible, terrible anti-Semite. Obviously, that meant that I was an anti-Semite too. And of course, the author was an anti-Zionist Jew called Joel Covell, who's a good friend of mine. He's now dead. Who wrote a book called Overcoming Zionism? Fantastic book. People should go and read. But the problem was I was putting up a Jew in my house who was a friend of mine, and that made me an anti-Semite. I thought that was fantastic.
But even if, let's just say you are anti-Semitic, so what?
Well, look, I think that there's a whole misunderstanding about what anti-Semitism is.
Yeah. Okay. So what is it?
Oh well, I mean, this is something I'm writing about at the moment. But the Zionists say, and let's put this back to, in particular, to a book by Bernard Lewis, key Zionist ideologue, who wrote a book called Semites and Anti-Semites. He says that anti-Semitism has always been just about racism against the Jews. It's creating the Jews as a race and being racist against the Jews. Now, as it turns out, that's not actually correct. The term anti-Semitism comes from the Semitic languages. And the Semitic languages, of course, are Aramaic, ancient Hebrew, Arabic, Phoenician, and a number of others. And when people started to understand different language families, they started to say that people who spoke these language families were effectively a race. And one particular guy who studied this, who is the origin, it said, of anti-Semitic thought, because he said the Semitic languages and the people who speak those languages are in an inferior race compared to the Aryans and the Aryan languages. So it said that he was the first anti-Semite. And in fact, he was the first person ever to be accused of being an anti-Semite by a particular other author some 5 or 6 years later who used the term anti-Semitism for the first time. But this is completely wrong. This is a complete misunderstanding. So let me try and explain this quickly. So this guy, Renan, is the French guy who wrote this, first of all, about the Semitic languages. Yes, he regarded people who spoke those languages as being an inferior race. But he didn't regard those who spoke Yiddish, the Ashkenazi Jews, he didn't regard them as Semites. He said that they are civilized people. So he spent all of his life studying Hebrew and the Jews, and he was a Judeophile. He wasn't an anti-Semite. The person who accused him of being an anti-Semite and who invented the term anti-Semitism was not the person who everyone thinks invented the term. The people think that the term was invented by a guy called Wilhelm Marr, who was a bit of a Nazi, right? But actually, he didn't invent the term. The term was invented by this other guy called Steinschreiber, who invented it in, I think, 1860, who called Renan, said that Renan was had anti-Semitic prejudices. Now, I found this out the other day, and I then thought, who is this guy, Steinschreiber? Why did he think this? Why did he think that Renan actually was including the Ashkenazim in his definition of the Semites? And it turns out that 30 years before he wrote the term anti-Semitism for the first time, he had set up in 1842 a secret Zionist organization to pursue the Jewish homeland. I mean, truly extraordinary. So the term anti-Semitism was invented by a Zionist in order to say that people were racist against the Jews, and completely neglected the fact that Renan was an actual racist, but he was mainly racist against Muslims, against the Arabs. Amazing.
These are just labels. I mean, let's just say, and I'm not saying I dislike black people, but let's say I do dislike black people and I'm accused of being racist. Okay, now what?
Well, we can think what we want to think, but of course, the force of the term racism, has a particular force in the West and indeed in the global South, in relation specifically to colonialism and slavery and the depredations following that in neocolonialism in the post-World War II period. But look, the prejudice, if I can put it like that, which Jews face today, to the extent that they do face prejudice, is not a form of racism. They don't get... Racism has to be, and all dictionary definitions have this as part of the definition, it has to be institutionalized and run through and by and led by the state. And that's why we refer to racism as something which is institutionalized in society against black people, against Muslims, etc. And for a period when the conflict in Ireland was on, against the Irish. So you don't have to have black skin or brown skin to be the victim of racism. You can have white skin. But nevertheless, the Jews don't face that. The Jews don't get stopped and searched and detained under the Terrorism Act when they come in and out of the country. They should do for being involved, those of them who are involved in the genocide. But they don't. It's the Muslims who bear the brunt of that. And Muslims, of course, face the biggest discrimination, not just in terms of state racism and being arrested and detained, but in terms of life outcomes. In the UK, for example, the poorest religious group in the UK are Muslims. The richest religious group in the UK, by some distance, are the Jews. On average. So the Jews don't face racism today. And so this nonsense about anti-Semitism is a term which is used simply for any prejudice that there might be against Jewish people, or indeed any criticism of the state of Israel or its genocidal policies, or the support for its genocidal policies by almost all, not all, but almost all Jews in the diaspora, as they call it.
That's what Norman Finkelstein said on my podcast. He said that the term is used basically to silence any criticism of the state of Israel.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's a process which the Zionists have been doing for a long, long time. I mean, even before the creation of the State of Israel, you can see evidence of the attempt to weaponize anti-Semitism. I mean, the Anti-Defamation League, set up, of course, in 1913, one of the key organizations today to weaponize anti-Semitism. There is another organization like it in most other Western countries. There's l'ICRA and l'ICRIF in France. There is the Board of Deputies and the Community Security Trust in the UK. There's a community security organization in Australia. Tons of these organizations. So ADL was set up in 1913, and already by the 1940s it was systematically spying on Arab Americans and indeed collaborating with the FBI. But it's only really since the creation of the Global Forum for Countering Anti-Semitism that the State of Israel has spent significant resources on trying to reshape the idea of what anti-Semitism is. And so, of course, it started in the 70s with the famous speech by the former foreign minister of the entity, Abba Eban, who made a speech in the US. I think 73 it was made, but 74 it was published, where he talks about the new anti-Semitism. What he's trying to say is there were the Nazis and they were racist against the Jews, but now what we face is a new kind of anti-Semitism from the left and from the Palestinians, and so they had to find a way to make what was regarded as racism by the Nazis into something which could be applied to the left and to critics of Israel, and that's what they've spent all the time since then doing, and of course that's what the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism is. It's a direct product of Israeli foreign policy and put in place in order to discipline all of us who would criticise the Zionists or indeed Jewish supremacist ideas wherever they might be found.
Yeah, just for clarity, I mean, I've got Christian friends who call themselves Zionist. When we talk about Zionism, what exactly are we talking about?
So Zionism is, I think that there's a lot of nonsense talked about this, and a lot of people say, oh, it's too complicated. We shouldn't use the word Zionism because it's a very complicated thing, and people have different meanings about it, and people sometimes it's in their heart, and it doesn't really mean killing all the Palestinians. And I say, well, let's be clear. There is an agreed definition of Zionism, which really the Zionists don't disagree with, and that is the Zionist movement is a movement and an ideology which believes in setting up a Jewish state in the historic territory of Palestine. That's it. That's the definition. Now, you can think it's a good thing, as the Zionists do, and you can say, oh, well, we're returning to our historic homeland, and there's been an unbroken Jewish involvement and life in the Levant for 3,000 or 4,000 years, and really all we're doing is we're indigenous to the Levant. Now, they can say all that, but the core of it is that they want to set up a Jewish state. They believe that's right. We believe it's wrong. Anti-Zionists believe that Zionism is inherently racist, that it must, by definition, be racist. It must be genocidal, because you can't set up a Jewish state in the Levant without ethnically cleansing and genociding and pushing out the people who live there, which, of course, they did most markedly previously in 1948 with the Nakba, and then, of course, in the last 3 or 4 years, a second Nakba is in process, which they themselves say when they come online and brag about it, and they taunt people that there's a second Nakba is coming. So look, Zionism is a very, very simple thing. It's about it's a racist idea to set up a Jewish state in the Levant. Now, it doesn't matter if you're a cultural Zionist or you're not a political Zionist or you don't like Netanyahu. All of those people who believe that there should be a Jewish state in the Levant are Zionists. And that's Jewish Zionists, and of course, as you say, Christian Zionists. And of course, as everyone says, there are many more Christian Zionists in the world than there are Jewish Zionists. True. But I think there's a misunderstanding about that as well, which is that, for example, Ilan Pappé, the famous anti-Zionist author, wrote a book recently called The
10 Myths. Oh, he also wrote The 10 Myths of Israel.
No, the Zionist lobby. He wrote a bigger book about the history of the Zionist lobby in the US and the UK. Now, his argument in there, essentially, without distorting it too much, is to say that it was Christian Zionists who invented Zionism, and that they taught it or gave it to the Jews. Now, that's actually not correct. It's not correct that the Christian Zionists invented Zionism. Jewish Zionists invented Zionism at least 400 years before the first Christian Zionist came along. There was settlement in what's now called historic Palestine in 1211, not in 1842, which there was as well, but in 1211. The 300 rabbis famously made aliyah, i.e. they ascended to Palestine to create a colony, and there have been significant waves of colonization by Jewish Zionists ever since, even although the Zionist movement itself, of course, didn't formally get started until the 1890s. I
didn't know that there was a secret war being waged against Iran by the British. This is absolutely fascinating, because when we talk on a day-to-day basis, it's always Israel or America versus Iran.
Iran was a British colony, and the purpose of this was, of course, to steal Iran's oil, and they had a client regime there, the Shah, and there was a revolution, of sorts, where the President Mossadegh nationalized the oil. And as a result, the Americans and the British launched a coup against Mossadegh. Now, the CIA were reluctant to do this, and it took MI6 a long time to convince them that they should come in on the act. And in 1953, they launched their coup, reinstalled the Shah, who, of course, ruled with British support. And if you go to Tehran, there's a museum there called the Museum of Holy Defense, which is their name for the Iran-Iraq War. And in the open part of the museum outside, there's all these British tanks, which of course were supplied to the Shah, Challenger tanks, which were supplied to the Shah by the British, and they supported them militarily. And when the Islamic Revolution happened in 1979, of course the Americans were in the lead, and it was the Americans that they were in conflict with. And of course, there was the hostage crisis when some radical students invaded the U.S. embassy and held the people in the embassy hostage. I mean, it's a fascinating story actually, because when they went to the door of the embassy, they climbed over the fence and they went to the door of the embassy, and the staff tried to keep them talking for an hour and a half, I think it was. And meanwhile, upstairs, the CIA people in the embassy were busy shredding all the documents that they could before the students got in. Eventually, the students got in, and they kind of, being students, they spent a long time taking the material out of the shredder and pasting it back together. And then they published it in a 25-volume book of all the different documents inside. I've been to that. It's now a museum of CIA misinformation. But the British, all the way through this, have been involved in trying to subvert Iran, along with the Zionists. The British, indeed, were involved in the assassination campaigns against Iranian nuclear scientists. Again, at that same museum, when I first went there in 2023, they had a display of the cars of at least 6 of the nuclear scientists who were assassinated, all of them in their cars, which were shot up or bombed. And the actual cars, they with the bloodstains on them. So these were assassinations done by the Mossad, yes, but MI6 appear to have been involved in these assassinations. And indeed, they also were involved in exfiltrating a Mossad agent who had been recruited from within Iran. And they exfiltrated this person, and they got him across the English Channel in a rubber dinghy with other genuine Iranian refugees. So MI6 has been involved in this for a long time. And of course, as people will know from understanding, there's a thing called there's a thing called the Kilowatt Network, which was the way in which the Mossad started to cooperate with Western intelligence agencies after the early 70s. And so MI6 and the CIA and other Western intelligence agencies, including the Five Eyes, which of course is Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the US and the UK, have been involved in collaboration with Mossad since the 70s. And that's part of the reason why the Zionists have such a whip hand over foreign policy. And the MI6 have continued to be involved in this all the way through. Just recently, what's happened, and I've just been writing some stuff about this recently, that there's a unit inside the Foreign Office in the UK which has been there effectively since 2014 in response to the annexation of Crimea by the Russians. And this is a covert operation which is there to attack Russia and to undermine Russia, involving all the British intelligence agencies. And that has recently, in 2023, it morphed into a separate covert propaganda operation called the Information Threats and Influence Directorate inside the Foreign Office. And it expanded its remit from just Ukraine and Russia to Iran, China, and indeed Gaza and Palestine. So they're involved directly in the propaganda against Iran just now. And of course, we also know that British are involved directly in the attacks on Iran that there have been in the last few months. I mean, I am in Bristol, in the southwest of England, and if you travel from Bristol to London, you go along the M4 motorway, which takes you all the way to London. And there are two military bases there. The first one you come to is called Fairford, which is relatively widely known, and that's where the heavy bombers from the US, the B-52s and the B-1s, take off from with their bunker buster bombs and their smart bombs and their dumb bombs to attack Tehran and Isfahan and Qasem Island and all the places that they've attacked, targeting military targets, as they would say. But of course, the result is that is attacks on civilian infrastructure, civilian casualties, many thousands of civilian casualties. As we know, the second base that you come to, which is 25 miles away, further along the motorway, which is much, much less known, is called RAF Welford, and it's run by the United States Air Force. It's allowed to be there by the British government, obviously, and it's the second largest USAF arms dump in the whole of Europe. It's a massive arms dump. It used to be an airfield. There's no airfield anymore, but there's hardly anyone in the country knows about it. That this is actually involved directly in complicity in the bombing of Iran. And of course, we suspect also that there will be special forces involved on the ground, but we don't know too much about that.
A great website, Swiss Policy Research, has got an article about the US and British involvement in the 79 revolution, saying that they actually supported it because it was going to protect oil interests. I don't believe that's true. I mean, on the contrary. I mean, they didn't. I mean, they supported the Shah, and they still support the Shah. If they could bring him back in again, they might do that. Although, of course, probably what the Western approach. Well, look, there's a Zionist approach to this, which is that they want to destroy the Islamic Republic and they want to balkanize Iran. They want to encourage secessionist movements in Balochistan, in Kurdistan, etc. And of course, these are some of the people who they recruit. The Kurds, in particular, quite often have been amongst the recruits which the Mossad pay and arm, and that's of course the people who were on the streets on the 7th and 8th of January this year, assassinating police officers and Basiji, and indeed sometimes assassinating their own people on their own side who are rioting or whatever. So, I don't believe there is a support for the Islamic Republic. And indeed, I believe that the Islamic Republic is the foremost anti-imperialist country in the world, more anti-imperialist than China, more anti-imperialist than Venezuela, and indeed Cuba. And it's only by the Islamic Republic of Iran winning in the battle with the Zionists that we will have the possibility of peace in the future, I think. Otherwise, we will be submitting to what I believe will be a Zionist empire. Is that why Iran seems to be isolated? Yes, I think that's right. I mean, the strategy which Iran has followed has been to encourage those who believe in resistance against Zionism, and of course that's meant Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad government, as it was in Syria, the Iraqi resistance, and of course not forgetting the Ansarullah in Yemen, and that became a formidable fighting force. And that was one of the key things which the Zionists have acted to try and dismember. They tried to dismember it in Lebanon. They helped to bring down the Assad government to install ISIS effectively in the government of Syria. And of course, they've only recently, the US has, on effectively Zionist instructions, kidnapped one of the heads of the popular mobilization units in Iraq, the Iraqi resistance. So it's only Iran that stands between between civilization and what would be, I believe, 1,000-year Reich empire for the Zionists. I mean, they're already expanding into Lebanon, into Syria. Yes, why? Well, because they believe, first of all,
they've always believed in a greater Israel. And it's just the kind of concept which, until about 2 years ago, people would say, well, that's a conspiracy theory. They don't really want to do that. But of course, they've always believed that. And you can see that back in the memoirs and the diaries of Herzl, of all the other Zionist leaders, and Jabotinsky as well. They've always believed that the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, extends all the way from the river to the sea and to the next sea. So it includes half of Egypt, part of Turkey, all of Lebanon, all of Syria, half of Iraq, all of Jordan. And that's what they've always wanted to do, to create effectively an empire, a transnational empire in West Asia. But actually, Greater Israel isn't enough for them. They also want to control the whole of West Asia. They've said this. Netanyahu has been saying this, talking about being a regional superpower, etc., in the last few months. So that's why they've, of course, had the Abraham Accords. That's why they have the close relationship with the United Arab Emirates and to some extent with the Saudis, although there's some difficulties in that relationship at present. So they want to expand to the whole of West Asia. But the strategy also has been to subvert and infiltrate every other country that has the possibility of interfering with their activities. So that's why there's a huge Zionist movement in many countries. 20 or 30 or 40 countries have formal Zionist movements. And then, of course, there are all sorts of other ways in which they try and infiltrate other countries. In the UK, there is no mainstream party which is anti-Zionist. Every mainstream party is Zionist. Same in the US, same in France, same in Germany. And that's because of Zionist infiltration. And that's a long-term process which involves many different methods and activities, but it's been effective. And so it's really very difficult now to have even the possibility of saying something which is even formally anti-Zionist and have any political support in any of these countries.
It is quite effective. About a year ago, I was driving in an Uber in Dubai, and I was chatting to the driver, and he said that you are prohibited from flying a Palestinian flag in the UAE.
Well, I mean, it's getting worse and worse all over the world, isn't it? I mean, there have been people just in the last few days in the UK who've been arrested for using the term intifada or talking about being anti-Zionist, and so there's an attempt by the police and the prosecution authorities in the UK to take their line from Tel Aviv, which is that there is no difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. That anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitism, and so if you talk about Free Palestine or From the River to the Sea or Intifada, you are by definition being anti-Jewish, and the police are now starting to arrest people and have them in for conversations on the basis not that they are being rude about Zionists, but that they're being rude about Jews. Of course, the two are not the same thing.
How did this happen?
Well, it's a long-term process. I mean, there's lots of different elements to it, okay? So the Zionist colony is unusual as settler colonies go, in the sense that it doesn't have a metropolis from which they all came. They were part of societies across the world, Russia and America, wherever. And in the settler colony, usually what happens is that the settlers become more and more extreme, and that the metropolis it sees the settlers as acting in its interests in general. The metropolis wants to be a little bit more cautious and doesn't quite understand why the settlers are getting so extreme. You saw that in South Africa, you saw that in Northern Ireland, and you see that in Palestine. But the difficulty is that there's no restraining metropolis. In fact, if you look at what's called the diaspora, i.e. Jews who live all around the world, they are, if anything, just as genocidal as the ones who've gone to Israel, maybe a little bit less. But there's no restraining force coming from Jewish or organised Jewry in the US or Canada or the UK against what's happening in occupied Palestine now. So that's part of the story. But the other part of the story is the fact that there is this diaspora. There are Jewish populations all around the world. Now, of course, they make up really small proportions of the population, even when even in the largest proportion they have in the population, which is in the US is 2%. In the UK, it's 0.4%. In other countries, it's less. But so how is it that a population which is so small proportionally is able to exert this kind of influence? Now, so you can think about this as being, well, it must be to do with Israeli foreign policy and Israeli intelligence and all that sort of stuff. And of course, that is part of the story. But that's not all of the story. Actually, you also find that what happens is that the Zionists are able to have a sort of pipeline of radicalization. They get their young, very young, and they bring them into the idea that they deserve to live, that they have a birthright, that's the terms they use, to live in Palestine. So they start training them with this formally in nurseries, in primary schools, in youth groups, in student groups, in young adult groups. At the age of 16, every Jew in the West is offered a free trip to Palestine to encourage them into believing that they have a right to steal Palestinian land and to encourage them into becoming settlers and or to joining the occupation forces. So they have a whole set of programs for that, and this is overseen by the Zionist movement in every country in which there is a formal Zionist movement, in the UK, in France, in Germany, in the US, in Latin America, in Australia, in South Africa as well, of course. So that's part of the process. But it's also to do with, and this is the thing which people don't like you saying, Norman Finkelstein has said this a few times, and he gets away with it because he's Jewish, he's allowed to say that. But it's also to do with the infiltration at the level of politics and finance and media throughout the society. And that's the Jews are able to do that, most of whom are Zionists, because they are, on average, wealthier than anybody else. On average, wealthier than white people, certainly wealthier than Hindus or Muslims or Sikhs or whatever. And so when that happens, you have a kind of economic decision-making apparatus which actually does take decisions in favor of supporting Zionism. Firstly, through, for example, setting up what I mentioned earlier, Zionist family foundations. So they set up foundations to give money to Zionist groups in the country which they're in, and also to give money to the IDF, to the settlements, to all sorts of other Zionist causes actually in occupied Palestine. But they also are involved in decision making in the society, and I mean economic decision making as well as political decision making. So if you look at the world's top billionaires, there are something like, according to Forbes, 2,700 billionaires, and the Jews make up 10% of that, with a global population of 0.2%. So there's a massive overrepresentation amongst the top billionaires. 6 of the top 10 billionaires, 6 of the richest 10 people in the world are Jews. Now, there's not a single one of them who is anti-Zionist. Now, people will say to me, "Oh well, what about George Soros?" Well, I say, George Soros is a Zionist. He might be a liberal Zionist. He gave $1 million to J Street in the US, but there's not a single one of them who is anti-Zionist. And that's a kind of outsized economic clout, and that process is repeated through the media, in the film industry, in pornography, in politics, all the way through. And that's what I would call that is infiltration, and it's what I've called the cardinal principle of the Zionist movement, which they encoded when they had their first World Zionist Congress in 1951 in Jerusalem, where they decided, and this is the interesting thing, they said the Zionist movement was set up to create a Jewish state in Palestine. So in 1948, they did it. 1951, they have their first Congress, World Zionist Congress since then, and there's a motion put that they will abolish the Zionist movement because they've reached their goals, and they will move forward without a Zionist movement, and it will all be folded away. And that motion is defeated with no votes in favour, and they decide to continue the Zionist movement. And of course, that's the purpose of the Zionist movement, as they set out in the what they call the Jerusalem program. This is something which is public. It's not a secret. Is the purpose of this is to spread Zionism throughout the world, wherever there are Jewish populations, to spread it and to effectively to infiltrate societies for the benefit of the Jewish state in Palestine. So that's a large part of the argument about how they're able to exert such influence.
Is the United States just another province of Israel, or is Israel a province of the United States?
Well, people get het up about this, especially people on the left. They say, well, it can't possibly be the case that the Zionists are able to influence U.S. imperialism. It's obviously the case that the U.S. imperialists are in charge. The tail doesn't wag the dog. There's only a small number of people in Israel, or even if you include the Zionist movement or the Jews in America, or whatever, so it's still only a small number of people. And I think that that argument had more strength 30 or 40 years ago. But actually, we live in a different world now. And what's happened as a result of this long-term infiltration process is that the decisions which are taken by the US government or the French government or the German government or even the UK government, which are seen by people as being in the interests of US imperialism or British imperialism, actually these decisions are taken by people who are believing and card-carrying Zionists, or who have been infiltrated or bought off by card-carrying Zionists. And you can see that with every single Western state. Less so with Spain to some extent, but the other main Western countries. I mean, the Prime Minister of our country says he is a Zionist without qualification, and it's perfectly clear that they take decisions in favour of the interests of Zionism and not in favour of British national interests or US national interests, whatever they might be. And of course, what's happened is that there's been an infiltration of the political administrative structure starting in the 1950s, famously with a guy called, and it actually goes back further than that, but let's start with 1950s with a guy called James Jesus Angleton, who was the head of counterintelligence in the CIA, and he was the official contact point between both the Shin Bet, which is Israel's internal intelligence agency, and the Mossad and the CIA. And he was effectively a Zionist asset, an agent inside the CIA. I mean, he's the only American intelligence official to whom there are two memorials in occupied Palestine today. And that process of infiltration and turning people and spying on the US, supposedly its greatest ally, is something which has continued ever since, so that you find by the time you get to the 1980s that the neoconservatives, read Zionists, some of them are Christians, but mostly they're Jewish, had started to exercise significant influence on the Reagan administration. And by the time you get to the second Bush administration and the invasion of Iraq, I mean, Iraq was invaded for the Zionists, and the people who took the decisions were not Americans just doing what the Zionists wanted. They were Zionists inside the government, Wolfowitz and Pearl, and all of those people who had got key positions in the Department of Defense, in the CIA, in the State Department, in the Treasury Department, and of course in the White House. And that has not lessened since then. We know that you can point to the people who are around Trump last time and this time, and you can see that, yeah, of course, there's some Christian Zionists there, a couple of them, Hegseth, for example, and Rubio, and others. But the main people who are around him, who advise him, who are close to him, who fund him, are Jewish Zionists, including, of course, his son-in-law, who is completely able to evade all responsibility and accountability because he doesn't have a formal position. Now, this is an indication that this is not the interests of the US or US imperialism, or certainly not the US workers which are being advanced here. It's the interests of the Zionists. And the Zionists have a whip hand here, which people, I think, are starting to realize, but it takes a lot of pressure on their ideas for them to get round to understanding the depth of the occupation that there is of the governments of the West by the Zionists.
What was JFK's position?
Well, as everyone knows, JFK was critical of the Zionists, and that's why some people say it's likely he was whacked by the Mossad. I mean, I don't have a view on that. I haven't done the research on it. It's certainly the case that, the famous JFK film by Oliver Stone believed that the CIA had done it. And he argued with people about that. But of course, let's remember he had someone in there as a producer to the film, Arnold Milchan, who was Mossad. So, I mean, the thing is that people who are critical of Zionism, the massive pressure is put on to get rid of them, to move them away. You just see what happened with Thomas Massey, the largest spending ever on a congressional primary. And that's how the Zionists operate. They brook no surrender. And of course, we see the same happening today in Latin America. We see the Honduras Gate scandal, where Argentina and Honduras and the US are acting together, it appears from the leaked emails and messages, on behalf and at the behest and funded by the Zionists. It's just truly incredible to see that. And you see that wherever you go, the specific role that the Zionists play in countries you wouldn't think they have anything to do with.
Our country, South Africa, has a somewhat strained relationship with Israel. I'm sure you know, taken into court, etc. But it seems to me that it was just symbolic.
Well, look, the ICC and the ICJ are not going to liberate Palestine. The people who will liberate Palestine will be the Palestinian resistance and their key supporters. And their key military supporters, as everybody really should know by now, are the Islamic Republic of Iran and the rest of the axis of resistance. If it wasn't for the Islamic Republic of Iran, there would be no Palestinian resistance of the sort which we now see, of the sophistication that we now see. We wouldn't have Hezbollah with the first-person drones destroying Merkava tanks and Israeli bases and Israeli commanders. None of this would have happened, the infrastructure of that, without the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I speak to people on the left on whom I agree with about almost everything on Palestine and even on Zionism, but they balk at the question of the Islamic Republic of Iran. They say, "Oh well, it's a reactionary, religion-ridden state." And I tell them, I said this to someone the other day, quite a prominent leftist. I said, you should go and look. You don't have to come to the same conclusion as me, but go and have a look. It really isn't what you think it's like at all. I mean, it really is not at all like that. And actually, if you want to liberate Palestine and defend human civilization against the depredations of the Zionists, then you have to do it by force of arms. The ICJ and the ICC is not going to do it. Now, of course, all credit to South Africa for taking the cases, I think. But there is also, of course, let's remember, a strong Zionist lobby in South Africa. And it's important to be cognizant about that. Let's remember the case of the Goldstone report, where Judge Goldstone was actually physically threatened and his family were threatened. And he actually, some of his family threatened him to climb down on his findings, which of course he duly did. So there are Zionist movements all over the place. And of course, South Africa is a really good case where you actually had Jews take up arms against the apartheid regime as part of Umkhonto we Sizwe and leading members of the armed wing of the African National Congress. And you don't see that kind of anti-colonial activity in Palestine today. There were Jews, some Jews, not very many, but there were some Jews took up arms against the French in Algeria. Mostly the Jews were on the other side. They were the Pied Noir and the colonists, and of course they had to leave when the Algerian Revolution was successful. But look, the way in which this operates is something which people have not understood. The power of Zionism to organize and to be disciplined and to have a pipeline of indoctrination, radicalization, and grooming of the young people to becoming strong believers in genocide and the defense of genocide all through their lives is something which I think nobody who comes either from a secular background or a Christian background really understands very well. I think the Muslims understand it a little bit better.
In terms of world politics, how important is Iran's resistance?
Well, I think that if Iran loses, that we face, a massively expanding Zionist empire. I mean, the Zionists know that they've only got really a couple of years while Trump's there. It's their best chance to expand as fast as they can. And that's why, of course, they're pressing Trump to start bombing again. Trump's reluctant. His military guys have told him it's not a good idea, that they haven't got the capacity, that they can't do it. But nevertheless, the Zionists are trying to push as far as they can, and they won't, of course, agree to any agreement which is made, even one which they signed themselves. They haven't kept to the terms of the agreement in Gaza. They've occupied extra parts of Gaza, as Netanyahu candidly admitted the other day. They still have trying to push further into Lebanon. They are occupying an extra part of the south of Syria. And they won't pay any attention to any agreement, even if they sign it themselves. So that is an expansionist and an eliminationist political movement which wants to expand its control everywhere. And unless it's defeated, it will have much more power than we can even imagine. And it's the only people who can defeat it are led by the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Axis of Resistance. Sure, I'd love it if Qatar joined in, or if we got some support from Oman or even Bahrain, and there were revolutions there, and there was a much wider axis of resistance, but there isn't at present.
I've got a friend who's Jewish, and he asked me the other day, I'm a Jew and I want a homeland. Why is that such a bad thing?
Well, what on earth is that? I mean, this is the thing, right? What is the homeland for the Jews? The Jews are not a nation. The Jews are a religion. Christians don't have a homeland. They live all over the world. There might be states where there's lots of Christians and there's a Christian majority, just like there are states where there's Muslim majorities. But there is no such thing as a homeland for Muslims or for Christians, and nor is there for Jews. Then this is a fundamental mistake, which has been made even by anti-Zionist Jews, I think. So, I've just done a piece for the UK Column magazine on the Bund, the Jewish Labour Bund, a famously anti-Zionist labour movement which was involved in the revolutionary movements led by Lenin. And in 1903, they came to the Congress of the RSDLP, Lenin's party, and they said, we want to be the only representative of the Jewish proletariat in the party. And Lenin said, no, this is a Zionist argument. He got that they were anti-Zionist, but this is a Zionist argument. The party must represent all workers, not just fractions of the workers. And they had a vote, and they lost that vote. But the people who are today saying, yes, I don't agree with the State of Israel, and I don't agree with a homeland for the Jews, but I do believe that the Jews are a people or a nation and that they have certain rights in that regard. Well, no, they don't have rights as a nation. They have rights as individuals, as human beings, and indeed as a religion. But you know, the homeland thing is a slippery slope towards genocide.
Can it not be argued that they are an ethnicity? He argues that they're a lot more than just a religion.
Well, what does that mean? I mean, this guy, Renan, who I mentioned before, right, he did this thing in 1860 where he talked about the Semitic languages, and he said the Ashkenazim were not Semites. They were civilized. So he distinguished them from the Arabs. And he then went on later in his life, I believe 23 years later, he did this famous talk, Are the Jews a Nation or a Religion? And he showed perfectly clearly that actually the Jews who became the leaders of the Zionist movement, the Ashkenazim from Eastern Europe, have virtually no connection to the Levant. They virtually don't have any ethnic or cultural connection even to the Levant. And he said this back in 1883. And of course, it's an argument which has been buttressed again by in 2008 by a guy called Shlomo Sand, who's at Tel Aviv University, who wrote a book called The Invention of the Jewish People. And he goes through it in great detail. He says that, you know, the Tartars, they were converted. The people in the Upper Caucasus, the Khazars or whatever, they were converted. And there's actually really very little connection. So the people who have the Semitic DNA, to talk in that kind of reductionist way, are the Palestinians. I mean, it's obvious. There's no ethnic relationship between the different sorts of Jewish people that there are in the world. The Sephardim, again, don't come from the Levant. They come from North Africa and from southern Europe. So it's not an ethnic group. Just like Muslims are not an ethnic group. There are all sorts of, and indeed, let's look at the falasha, the arguments they had inside Israel about whether they could have Ethiopian Jews. And they're like, on the one hand, the Ashkenazim are opposed to this because they're black and we don't want black people. On the other hand, they have to make the argument that they're just like us, they're the same ethnic group as us because they're Jews. Well, of course, it's a nonsense. They're just the same religion.
So if somebody accuses me of being anti-Semitic, is a fair response to that, well, no, I'm not anti-Semitic. I've got nothing against the Arabs.
Yes, I think that's right, yes. But this requires a lot of deconstruction still. I mean, I'm going to write this stuff up, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about this, which is being, of course, consciously encouraged by the Zionists.
How can I follow your work?
So I'm on X, formerly Twitter, at tracking_power. I'm on Substack at Tracking Power. I'm on Instagram. And I run an organization called Spinwatch, spinwatch.org, and also the wiki website where we put up profiles of tons of organizations called powerbase.info.
Just by the way, your knowledge on South Africa is quite good. Have you been here?
I have, yes. I was in South Africa in, was it 2004, I think? Yes, in 2004, which is where I met the terrible anti-Semitic Jewish person, Joel Covell, actually at International Sociological Conference. Yes, I went to Durban and to Cape Town and to Joburg and to Khayelitsha and Soweto and various places.
Okay, well, on that note, David Miller, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thank you.